I do if there's a yeast shortage? At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were shortages of many things. One of the first things was yeast. When I was creating this project, I thought about how I can make bread with smaller amounts of yeast or with no yeast at all. I did some background research and found out about other types of bread. My hypotheses are that the bread without yeast won't taste as good. The bread with baking soda will rise the least, and the bread with baking powder will rise the most because it works more quickly than yeast. So in the same amount of rising time, it will rise more. My variables. My independent variables are the leading ingredient, which is half the yeast, baking soda, and baking powder. My dependent variables are the taste and peel of the bread and how much the independent variable causes the bread to rise. The control variables are the oven temperature, other ingredients in the recipe, time spent kneading the dough with the electric mixer, the time rising, and the time in the oven, and the size of the buns formed by the dough before rising. My first batch of buns was 1 tablespoon of instant yeast. My second was half tablespoon of instant yeast. My third was 1 tablespoon of baking soda and 1 tablespoon of vinegar. My fourth was 2 tablespoons of baking powder. The chemical reaction with the buns with yeast was that it rose like most buns. It was a nice shape, and at the top and bottom, it was only a bit brown like most buns. The difference between the recipe with half yeast and the recipe with full yeast was that the recipe with half yeast was a bit smaller and more pale. Bread rises because the yeast goes and it takes the sugar and turns it into carbon dioxide. Then the gluten in the bread traps the carbon dioxide inside, causing the bread to rise. The chemical reaction with the baking soda was that vinegar was added, and when the baking soda and vinegar mixed, it created carbon dioxide. The buns with baking soda had brown spots on the bottom, but not the top. They didn't rise as much as the buns with the full amount of yeast. And the chemical reaction with the baking powder, I didn't have to add vinegar because baking powder contains baking soda and a dry acid, which combine to produce carbon dioxide. The buns were only slightly brown on the bottom and pale everywhere else. The baking powder buns were pointy at the top instead of rounds, and you could taste the baking powder flavor. I gave 12 people a blind taste test and asked them to complete a Likert-style rating scale, with 1 being gross and 5 being very good. The first one was bread with baking soda, and the average was 2.83. The second was with the full amount of yeast, and the average was 4.16. The third batch was with half amount of yeast, and the average was 3.91. Lastly, the bread with baking powder had an average of 2. The taste for the bread with half yeast, baking powder, and baking soda was that the yeast was the best, the baking soda was the next, and the baking powder was the worst. Those were the same for the growth and size. In a future situation, if I only had a tiny bit of yeast, but I needed to make bread, first I would use just half the yeast because it had really good taste and it wasn't rubbery like some of the other buns. If I ran out of yeast, I'd make the bread with baking soda and vinegar because it was really good too. Even though it didn't rise as much and taste as good, it was still yummy, and the bread still rose somewhat. It was only a bit rubbery. Using baking powder would be a last resort for me because the bread did not rise very much. I could taste the baking powder, and the buns were quite rubbery. The baking powder buns were misshapen and had little lumps on them. These are the sites that I checked to find most of my information.